Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if we will find the answer to those questions here, but of course, the most expected answer was the high upfront costs, which is the one that had the most votes, and which is generally the one that is targeted by policies in general. So there's a lot of policies promoting or under either rebates or discounts for different electrified technologies, but there are not as many policies to cover the others, which are also barriers and received votes as well. So I'm going to try to go through a few of them at least in the presentation. So to start, as an introduction, I wanted to mention that we published the energy efficiency market report this year in November. And what I'm going to present now is part of the report. So everything that you will see in the presentation is there, and you can go through it and find a lot of new analysis on different end use sectors, but also covering different regions of the world in a new chapter that we presented this year. And I wanted to also to give the main message of this report, which is that the world is not yet on track to double the energy efficiency progress. As we know during the COP28, many countries or all the participants committed to double the energy efficiency progress through 2030. This energy efficiency progress doubling takes the 2022 numbers, which is global energy intensity progress of around 2%. So we will need about 4% every year through 2030 to achieve this doubling. But as we see on the estimated numbers for 2024, we are not doubling, but we are halving. So not only we are not progressing, but we are moving backwards in some sense. So we need more accelerated policies. But the good news is that in the last decades, there were many countries that achieved this 4%. So it's possible, but we need to accelerate the implementation of energy efficiency policies. And today we're going to, of course, talk about electrification. But I also wanted to say why electrification is important. And what we see here is the share of electrification in the different sectors and the share of electrification in 2030 for the IEA net zero scenario. This net zero scenario is one of the possible paths to achieve a net zero energy sector by 2050, but not the only one. And electrification is important for energy efficiency, but also, of course, for decarbonization, and combining electrification with the implementation on this, or installing more renewable energies in the electricity generation mix is one of the most effective ways of decarbonizing the sector. So what we need, or what we see here, is that electrification levels in buildings and industry have been progressing quite steadily in the last few years, while the transport sector didn't see a lot of progress before 2023. But this is going to change significantly for 2030, because transport is the one that is expected to progress the fastest. In this case, with the adoption of EVs, which is not only electric cars, but also 2- and 3-wheelers, which are very relevant in countries in Southeast Asia, in China and India, for example. And in the case of the electrification level, today we are at around 20% in the world, and we will need to reach about 28% to stay on track with the net zero scenario. And this is why we talk about energy efficiency and electrification to be connected and having synergies. In this case, we do the analysis on internal combustion engine vehicles versus battery electric vehicles. And what we see in terms of final energy use is that the most efficient electric vehicle uses about 1/4 of the energy needed or used in an equivalent combustion engine vehicle. But this electricity, of course, needs to be generated. So when we move to primary energy, we see that this depends more on both the generation efficiency, but also the efficiency of the vehicles start playing a bigger role here, where we see that the lower levels of the most efficient car can save a big amount of energy compared to the least efficient car including within the EVs. But also when we have an average generation or a cleaner generation mix, we can see that the most efficient EV can save almost 1/3 of primary energy compared to, or can consume 1/3 of primary energy compared to an ICE. And this is not only true for electric vehicles or for the electrification of transport, but also for heating. In this case, what we compare is different houses with different insulation and different heating systems. As we see here, in all cases, of course, using a gas heater requires much more energy than using heat pumps, even a not so efficient heat pump or a high efficiency heat pump. And in all cases, it requires less energy. And as we increase the insulation, the energy needs are reduced in general, overall, of course. But when we go to how much money the users are saving, in these cases, this depends more on where the electricity prices and the gas prices in the country. For example, we can see in Sweden where electricity and gas are priced similarly in terms of kilowatt hours, that switching to a heat pump, either of them can save between 60 and 70% of the energy bills. But when we go to the UK on the other side, where electricity is 4 times more expensive than gas, switching to a heat pump can have either very low savings or no savings, or even increase the bills. Then when we analyze France, we see that, which is something in between, where electricity is about twice as expensive as gas, just a bit more. Switching to a heat pump provides savings that are also significant. But in all cases, we see that insulation plays a big role and is a lot more relevant in those places where electricity can be more expensive. So we need to, of course, think about which measures will need to be implemented first, because in cases where electrifying might not lead to savings, insulating first will be a good choice. And then you will require a smaller and cheaper heat pump, and you will be saving money on the bills as well. And to finish, I wanted to have a summary of what I've been talking about, but on a complete household level and on different countries. As we can see here, we compare an average house in each of the countries versus a fully electrified one. So for example, in countries where gas is very expensive, such as Austria or the Netherlands, or is expensive compared to electricity, electrifying the space heating is a good measure that provides savings on the bills. But doing the same in Canada, or as we saw in the UK or in the US, might not bring the the same savings as there. But when we look at private vehicles, in most of the cases, gasoline is an expensive resource. And when we switch to EVs, if home charging is available, the expenses can be reduced to less than half or 1/3 in many cases. And we can see that in all countries, in all the cases. So this is also, I think, important because for the case of gasoline, taxes play a big role there. But for the case of gas and electricity, in many cases, there are different taxes and charges that are not assigned the same way. So there's a place that where we can act as policymakers, either by modifying taxes or switching charges from one to the other. Yeah, that would be positive to show gains in the bills as well. Yeah, I wanted to finish with that, so thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Marion Santini. I work for the Regulatory Assistance Project. RAP is a global NGO. We're working on policy innovation in the energy transition. So I'm going to talk about the role of energy efficiency policy in the electrification context. And at RAP, we started this work because we were hearing claims that energy efficiency policies were becoming less useful with the increase of renewable electricity, with the fact that renewable electricity was becoming more available. And we didn't think that was the case. So we wanted to understand how the role of energy efficiency might be changing in the coming years, taking into account these changes we're seeing in the energy system and also the changes that we are expecting in the energy system. So first, what do we mean by electrification? And why is it so important to think about it when we design energy efficiency policies? Well, we think that electrification will bring major changes, and I think Federico has explained a few of these changes, and also why electrification is so important to meet climate goals. So to take an example, in the EU, the European Commission assessed that the share of electricity in final energy consumption needs to double by 2040. And why is that? Well, electricity is getting cleaner, of course, but also because the equipment is using electricity is more efficient, as we've seen in the previous presentation. So what exactly is needed for electrification to happen? If I try to simplify the situation, we can expect three types of changes. The first one is that we need new equipment, like heat pumps and electric cars, to be deployed. The second type of changes is that we will need more renewable electricity, as well as massive investments into electricity grids. And the third type of change, and you see they're all interconnected, is that we will need to have a more flexible electricity system with end users being in a position to produce, consume, and store electricity flexibly. So now, let me get back to each of these points. First, equipment. So electric equipment will need to be deployed in a lot of sectors. And here you can see that's what the European Commission is planning for the EU to reach its climate goals. So you see that electrification is happening in the different sectors of the economy. And that means more heat pumps, that's the stock of heat pumps, but also more electric cars, that's the share of electric cars. And well, of course, we will need more electricity to power this equipment, as well as major investments into the grid. So something quite interesting in the EU, but it's also the case in other places in the world, is that electrification relies on the growth of renewable electricity. And that's what the EU mix is expected to look like. And in the green bars here, you can see the share of renewable energy is quite important. And a lot of that is solar and wind energy. And as we know, the production of wind and solar electricity can vary during the day, and that has implications for other parts of the system. So we will need a more flexible system, I already mentioned. And as you can see in this slide, in the EU, the need for flexibility will double by 2030. And we know this can be achieved with different processes and technologies, for example, batteries that can store electricity. Now, what we also know is that a very large potential for flexibility will be in our heating system as it is electrified. So basically, heat pumps require electricity to run. They would do that efficiently, but they can also bring flexibility services. And that's the case where a heat pump user would be in a position to modify its heating schedule to respond to requests from the grid. And I'm going to come back to this point. But what do all these changes mean for energy efficiency policies? Does energy efficiency policy contribute to electrification as it is right now? How can we increase this contribution to make energy efficiency policy more relevant in the future? That's the question we started to look at. So in the EU and in other parts of the world, energy efficiency policies like the ones you see on the slides were designed to save energy. And in most cases, it didn't matter whether you were saving fossil fuel, renewable electricity, or any other fuels. It also didn't matter whether you were enabling other benefits, like demand-side flexibility. And we think that this might be changing as we need to accelerate action on all fronts. So what does it mean? We identified 3 values that energy efficiency policy can bring to the electrification process, which you can see in this slide. You could present them differently. You could have more values coming in. That's the one we chose to focus on in our work. And let me briefly go through each of them. First, energy efficiency policy can mitigate the growth of electricity demand. So basically, we know that electricity demand is going to increase, and energy efficiency policy can act to make sure that this growth is manageable. That seems obvious, but actually the implications for energy efficiency policy design are quite complex. For example, saving electricity will be very important, but promoting efficient electric equipment is needed to replace fossil fuels, and this equipment will require more electricity to run. So you see, there are some impacts that needs to be taken into account when you go into the design of policy goals for energy efficiency. And at the moment, a lot of the policy we are doing is saving fossil fuel. And the time and location of the savings is not very important. Whether you use more gas in the morning or in the afternoon does not really matter. But as we will be shifting progressively our policy towards saving electricity as well, when and where electricity is saved will be more relevant. And let me briefly explain why. So it's a very complicated graph, but let's look at this example. It's an overview of a daily electricity generation mix, let's say in a particular location. So as you see in this case, and that would be the case in several different locations across the world, solar panels would be quite active in the middle of the day, and therefore there would be more electricity at that moment. I think we know about the implications this has for flexibility, right? Depending on the consumption patterns, in this particular place, it might be useful to move some electricity consumption to the middle of the day because it's available, cleaner, and cheaper. So that is the implication for flexibility. But it also has implication for energy efficiency policy. And in this exact case, it might be more important to increase the efficiency of equipment and processes that run in the evening, because that's where electricity is less available, less clean, and also less cheap. So that's just one example. And maybe you could imagine a different situation where electricity is produced or consumed at a different time. And that's why location of energy savings will become also very important and a very important aspect of energy efficiency policy. The situation will not be the same across the different places, even within a same country. So, for example, in some places, there might be a grid congestions problem, and that's an issue we're increasingly seeing in the EU. What we know is that in the US, energy efficiency improvements have been used by energy companies to postpone specific investments in grid. And that's something we could imagine replicating in the EU. Now, there is another value for energy efficiency policy in an electrification context, and it's very specific to building insulation. Insulated buildings can keep heat for longer periods. This means that people can turn off the electric heating when it's needed without losing comfort. So it basically increases the flexibility capital of people. And we think that's a very powerful feature of insulated buildings, but we're still wondering how this value can be recognized in policies. Can we promote the installation of heat pumps with smart controls coupled with insulation? So I think that's something we should explore further. And finally, the third value, I think there's more understanding about this one. Usually, we have looked at the role of energy efficiency policy to bring affordability and inclusiveness benefits. Now, I think what is changing is that very often we've looked at energy efficiency in isolation. I think it will be very important to increasingly look at packages of solutions. For example, insulation, solar panels, batteries coupled with heat pumps, smart controls. How can these technologies combine, protect people from price volatility? How can they make the transition work for people? I think we need to look into this question as well. So in our briefing, you will find some of this information as well as recommendations. We don't have all the answers yet, so we're only starting this work stream. We now really think we need to rethink the role of energy efficiency policies. So I would be very interested to hear about your ideas and your examples in this discussion today, but also don't hesitate to reach out after the meeting. Thank you very much.